Okay, welcome everyone. Our guests are filing into the virtual room here. Welcome everyone. Wherever you're joining us from, we welcome everyone and thanks for taking time to come to our event today on behalf of the whole team at Bentham Science. We welcome you no matter where you are. Let us know where you're joining us from. You can introduce yourself in the chat room, excuse me, in the chat window there, and let us know where you're joining us from today. My name is Scott, and I am a science communications trainer based here in Tokyo, Japan. But I am merely the co-pilot of this spaceship today. Our main presenter is my friend and colleague. He's the author of more than 300 papers, author or co-author of more than 300 papers. He is a journal editor himself at Historical Biology with another publisher. He is a beloved lecturer, professor, and internet personality. Hopefully, I've embarrassed him enough. Professor Gareth Dyke. Gareth.
How are you doing? Nice to see you, Scott. How's everybody doing? It's great to see people are putting their names and where they're from in the chat. That's absolutely fantastic. Really good to see Nigeria, England, Indonesia, Malaysia. Wow, France. Fantastic. So many people putting their names in. My eyes can't keep up. I live in Budapest in Hungary, although as you can probably hear, I'm English. But great to see everybody. Great to see you, Scott. How are you doing? Everything going well?
Doing great. It's a chilly winter day here in Tokyo, just like I like it. I'm Canadian, so I love that cold winter weather. How about there, where you are today in Budapest? How's the weather today,
Oh,
Gareth?
snowing earlier and icy and around freezing. So not that depends whether you like snow or not. If you like snow, you'd be having a great time at the moment. So
Sounds perfect to me. That's my inner Canadian. Welcome, everyone. Great to see everyone introducing themselves in the chat window. And if you are new to our research series here, our presentation series, excuse me, with Bentham Science, I'll tell you a little bit about Bentham Science here. So Bentham is a growth publisher, 116 traditional journals, more than 70 open access journals, more than 1,300 ebooks. And topics lean towards the physical and life sciences, chemistry, biology, medicine, engineering, and many more, and impact factors up to 7. One of the key features of Bentham Science is a very robust and highly ethical peer review process, one of the strongest of any publisher in the world, and listed on all the major indices. And if you are a library sciences manager joining us today, just scan the QR code you see on the screen here. You can get a free trial for your institution up to 3 months, absolutely free, no strings attached whatsoever. You can sample Bentham's high quality, rigorously peer-reviewed journals at your own institution. So scan the QR code and the Bentham team will get in touch with you and connect you with a free trial. So on behalf of everyone at Bentham, thank you so much for joining us today at our event.
absolutely. And don't forget, don't worry if you can't scan the QR code right now, we'll show it to you again at the end of the event. So don't worry, don't worry. And as Scott mentioned, this does give your institution 3 months of free access to all of those fantastic Bentham Science publishers, journals, and ebooks. So if you're a librarian, do give it a scan. Maybe you know a librarian you'd like to send the QR code to. That would also be fantastic. Really great. Thank you.
Great, more guests coming into the room now from, oh wow, from everywhere. Russia, Pakistan, South Africa, Spain, Serbia, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia. Welcome everyone. Thanks so much for taking time out of your busy schedule, whether you're a researcher or you're a library sciences manager or funder. We appreciate you taking time to join us today. Gareth, we've got a great talk today for our guests. I hope they enjoy it. We've got I think, some tips and tricks that will really help people to feel more confident and comfortable in presenting their research to a global audience. Are there any thoughts that you would like our guests to keep in mind as they listen to your talk today?
Well, yeah, these skills that we present in these training webinars are not talents, right? You're not born being able to make a great graphic or being able to give a decent presentation, a good presentation at a conference or at a department seminar. These are things that you can learn to do better. So that's the reason that Scott and I give these presentations, drawing on our own experience, drawing on our own backgrounds. So yeah, that's what I'd say to get started. Like if you're joining us today and you'd like to learn some tips how to do a more effective presentation, we hope that the skills that we share, the tips that we give you access to in these presentations will help. That's what I would say to get started today.
Those are great tips, and you raise a great point, Gareth. It's not about what you're born with. If you're perhaps naturally introverted, sure, it can be more difficult to present at conferences, but I've seen some very introverted, very lab rat type people become incredible presenters once they've had a chance to prepare and practice their presentation. I've also seen a lot of very experienced and very, incredibly intelligent researchers with amazing findings feel initially very nervous about presenting their research to an audience. But again, once they feel that they have prepared and practiced, it's amazing to watch the confidence grow as they prepare. So, no matter what stage of your career that you're in, I'm sure there's some tips today that will help you to feel much more confident at your next talk.
Absolutely. And don't forget, everybody gets a certificate, everybody gets a recording. You can feel free to put any questions in the chat box at any time. And we'll have a Q&A session at the end of our event today. I think we're just about ready to get started, Scott. What do you think?
I think so. I think our guests are filing in. So, yeah, let's
Cool.
kick off.
Let's do it. So we're going to talk today in our event, presenting your research, learning to make great posters, and giving great research presentations about three related aspects of the process. Preparation, preparing yourself for a presentation, be it online or in person at a conference, a department seminar, another university, another research institute, as well as a number of hacks that we have. Impact, how to speak effectively, and we're going to give you a number of tips and examples from our own experience, right, Scott? This is something that you can develop as a skill to get better at giving presentations, I would definitely say.
And also a note, if you are not a native English speaker, the same tips apply. In fact, they apply double. The more you practice and prepare, the more confident you'll feel, even if English is not your first language. I know how it feels. I sometimes have to present in Japanese, which is not my native language, of course. It can be very nerve-wracking and very stressful, but with some planning and preparation, you can build confidence for your next talk, no matter what your native tongue is. So
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's get started. And as we said before, any questions, put them in the chat box. We'll be back to address them a little bit later on in our event today. But let's begin our session today by talking about preparation, how you can prepare effectively for your next presentation, online or in person. But before we even do that, we're just going to do a quick poll to make sure that everybody listening to this is still awake. What types of research presentations have you given in your career so far? Do give us that information, right, Scott?
right, you can select any number of these. You can make multiple selections if you've given poster talks, slide talks, keynotes, panel talks, workshops. Feel free to click those in the poll here. We're just curious to see what experiences you've had as a research presenter. Professor, I would imagine you've given all of these. I think I've done at least three of these in a research context. How about yourself, Professor?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Probably least frequently would be those panel talks where you're
Right.
part of a group of people talking about a particular topic. Done a few of those, definitely poster presentations. I was always really bad at those. I always did those at the very last minute for conferences. Slideshows, oral presentations. Yeah, also not so many keynotes, I'm afraid to say. Those are like often famous Nobel Prize
Mhm.
winners, big scientists who would be invited to give plenary keynote speeches. Definitely lots of workshops and tutorials though, 100%. Yeah.
I think likewise, our guests tend to have more experience with poster and slide talks, naturally. Also, a good deal of workshops and tutorials as well. Fantastic. Well, let's end the poll here and take a look at the results. Okay, so we've got 63% of our guests have given posters, talks, 94% slide talks, fantastic. 19% keynotes, wow, that's a great number. 11% panel talks, and 42% of our guests today have given workshops or tutorials. That's great. So we do have a lot of
Yeah.
experience in our audience tonight. So kudos to everyone for joining, and hopefully you'll come away with some fresh tips to use at your next talk.
If we missed something or you've given a kind of presentation that's not included, do let us know. That would be also fantastic. And do let us know how you feel and what you think about a lot of the content that we present in our webinar, in our workshops today. Of course, these are the three top situations where you might need to give a presentation as an academic researcher. Really, number one, the first kind of situation that does come to mind would be those academic conferences, either online or in person, or maybe in a hybrid situation, as well as department meetings and those informal research presentations. For me, at least, the most stressful of these three situations was always department meetings, when I had to give presentations in front of people that I actually worked with every day. I found that to be most stressful, but of course, always important to do the best job possible when giving presentations in any setting. And one of the really important reasons for this is, of course, that people form impressions of you, of your research, of your presentation style really quickly. And then, of course, they're quite slow to change those impressions. And you also, I would say, from my own experience, you never know who's going to be in the audience of a presentation that you might give and how that might, in the future, translate to an opportunity. It could be a postdoc position, it could be a job, it could be funding. So always do the best job that you can. Never mind how many people are in the audience, because anybody could be in that audience. And it's also important for us to have a think about when it's a good idea to present your results. Before you publish, you may need to be a bit careful about how and what you present your results and where you present your results. You may need to declare the fact that you've done a presentation about some unpublished research results to a target journal later. Of course, that's not so important if it's in a research group meeting or a departmental seminar, but a published conference proceedings or a conference abstract would potentially need to be declared to a journal that you're later hoping to submit to. After you publish, of course, this is the most common setting in which researchers will give presentations about their work. You're going to also therefore have to check the conference guidelines. What kind of situations are you going to be in as you promote your trends, identify trends, promote your work, get feedback, get advice on your ideas, and network? If you're a medical researcher, it may be important to consult your institution if you're going to go and give a presentation that contains information or content about patients. But when to present and where to present are key starting points for the process and for our discussion today. And of course, don't get hoodwinked by all of those fake conferences that we see out there all of the time. We all get emails often inviting us to participate in conferences that often may not actually be real conferences. There are many fake predatory conferences out there. They try to cheat you out of your time, your money, and out of your research. And it can often be quite difficult as a young researcher to spot and identify the differences between real and fake academic conferences. So if you're not sure if a conference invitation that you've received is real or fake, you can go and check on this website that we've put here on the bottom of the slide. It's called thinkcheckattend.org, and it's a great place to start initially if you've been invited to a conference and you're not sure if it's real or not. So that's also very important. And this is a great graphical representation, a great slide for the start of our discussion on this topic, because of course, if you're writing a research article, what you put and the shape of that research article will be quite different to what you might put into a presentation. And your presentation sections, the way that your presentation is put together, and the information that you are going to talk about in your presentation will be much heavier on the results side of things than it would be in a research article. So we're going to talk in this presentation today about how you can really emphasize and get across the message of your research results as opposed to writing those up as a research paper. So in an article, you talk much more about the methods, you talk more information in the introduction, the discussion. In your presentation, we're going to go heavier on the results. What is the takeaway? What's the main message from your research results? And presentations, of course, have a range of different features. What's the purpose of the presentation that you're going to be giving in your department, in another department, at another university, or at an academic conference? What's the purpose of your presentation? Who are the audience? Very, very important at the outset. And one of the first questions that I would always ask, I know Scott does the same, when being invited to give a presentation, first question, who's going to be in the audience? Will it be PhD students? Will it be experienced researchers? Will it be anybody from out there on the street, members of the public? Because the way that you present, the information that you include, the way that you pitch your presentation, your talk, will be different depending upon the audience and also, of course, the style. So these are great questions to begin with when you've been asked or you have to give a presentation. What's the purpose of the presentation? Who's going to be in the audience? And what kind of style are you going to go for? Most obviously, will it be in person or will it be an online presentation? Because obviously the way that you deal with those different situations will potentially be quite a lot different. And also, when you're thinking about presenting your work, and we're going to talk about posters in a little bit later on in our webinar today, but these, of course, are the main ways that we communicate about our research in a presentation setting as researchers. A poster, an oral presentation, such as the one that we're giving right now, or a short conference article, which we're not going to talk too much about today in this event. We do have lots of other training available. If you look at our website, sidetrain.com, you'll learn more about the kinds of training, the kinds of events that we do all the time for universities and publishers around the world. But today, talking about oral presentations and talking about posters as we begin to think about how you're going to get your message across as a researcher. Posters, of course, and remember I mentioned that when I used to have to give posters at academic conferences, I often didn't do a really fantastic job. I left this until the very last moment, but of course, posters are widely used in the academic community. Most conferences, as you know, include a poster presentation section. This is where you, of course, have a graphical representation of your research. You stand next to it and you talk about it when people come up to you to want to learn more. So what you've got to do, of course, is summarize information, your research, concisely and attractively in order to publicize it and further generate discussion. These are conversation starters, posters at conferences. Its aim, the goal, is to get somebody interested in your research, get them to come up and talk to you more about what you've been doing. So a conference poster, an effective one, will usually be a mix of text with tables, graphics, pictures, and other presentation formats. And these are particularly popular for early career researchers. And I don't really agree with this next point, but often people do consider giving a poster presentation at a conference to be lower risk and easier than presenting a talk. But of course, this is not necessarily the case. The key is to get noticed. As we've mentioned, the key here is to spark a conversation about your research. And this means, of course, that you've got to put the time in to putting your poster together. Don't do what I always used to do and rush it at the last moment. You want a eye-catching, stimulating, and thought-provoking poster. The question, of course, is how? Now, when you're giving a poster talk at a conference, you've got that networking opportunity. You're going to be using this as a way to ensure that people get to know about your research. Make that best impression possible because, as we mentioned already, when people see you presenting, giving a talk or giving a poster, they're going to form a quick first impression of you and of your research. And that's not going to change easily. So this is great for career development, getting your career to the next stage, enhancing your career with an effective presentation and effective presentation style. So conference posters are great networking tools, ways in which you can articulate and communicate about your research. So a great poster, as we've said, it's a visual abstract. It's a way to get others interested in learning more about your research. It's a conversation starter. And we think that a lot of researchers going to conferences with posters are missing this opportunity, are missing this as a fact. It's not supposed to be all about your research, all of the information there on the poster. You are going to use this as a networking and communication tool. It's not a word for word copy of your paper. It's not a place to dump all of your data and technical lingo. And how many times have you seen such a poster at a conference? It's hard to understand. It's got loads of information on it. It's not gonna start that conversation, right, Scott? I know you've seen hundreds of these pieces of graphics posters.
Yes, and this advice also holds true for slide presentations. So we feel tempted, even us, and we struggle with this too sometimes. We feel tempted to put more and more information onto posters and slides. We want to include all the value that we can and give lots more discussion and talking points. But really, human beings, we appreciate a bit of negative space, a bit of white space. It makes the information that's there easier to absorb. So rather than fill your entire slideshow with graphics like this, and figures and explosions of color, try to leave a bit of negative or white space on your poster. You'll find that people will absorb the information that's there much better.
So what we've done is we've put together a few tips from our own experience, how to make a great design for your next poster. And this is like the bones of it, the nuts and bolts of it. And you can have a look at this slide. Do take a screenshot. As we mentioned, you'll get access to the recording of this event at the end. But the kinds of things that go into an effective poster as a networking tool at a conference, right, Scott?
Right, and as you can see, most of these points, and by the way, we have an entire presentation just on these points alone, so we've crammed, 90 minutes of workshop into one slide. But basically, most of these points deal with keeping your ideas concise, brief, and catchy. Look at number 2, word counts low. Look at number 3, clear and concise. Formatting, things that stand out. One of my favorites is number 7, layout. What I find with many researchers when I'm editing posters and slides is I find that there's a lot of alignment issues. There's all kinds of tips and tricks you can use with PowerPoint, for example, to get all of your columns and boxes to align cleanly. That makes your work look much more professional and just easier to scan and absorb. So again, if you're interested in having a full talker presentation on this topic alone, reach out to us. We love giving this one, don't we, Gareth?
Definitely, definitely. So great poster design. And we're not great designers, we're just following the guidelines when we put together slideshows, when we put together presentations. This is a great starting point after, of course, you've considered what the purpose of your presentation is, who's going to be in the audience, and what style you're going to put into your presentation. And this is a recommended layout. Okay, so as Scott will explain, you can put the information into a certain format so that it's easier for somebody reading the poster, engaging with the poster to understand.
This is a great universal layout for this kind of landscape style poster, or even for slides as well. If you can organize them cleanly this way, you can have them go from top to bottom, left to right, and this would be a pretty standard format for most landscaped posters. You might be, your native language might be a right to left language, but regardless, when you're presenting at most conferences, the standard is left to right and top down. And just get those columns to align cleanly. You'll find that people's eyes will scan naturally across your poster if you lay it out this way.
Great advice. So there's the recommended poster layout. And think about these questions. I mean, you're going to be changing the paradigm. You're going to be using your poster as a networking tool. You're going to be sparking conversations with people, getting them to come up to you and talk to you about your research. So, what is the most interesting or astounding or important finding from your research project? What is the key takeaway from your research? Going to put that into your poster. How can I visually share my research with conference attendees? What's the best way to get the takeaway, the message, the key findings from your research across to your audience? People coming up to you and talking about your research. And don't forget this great quote, because there may be hundreds or thousands of posters at a conference. You will want something that's going to stand out and really make a difference. So perhaps striking visuals. That's going to make people remember you. And it's important that they do remember you. An impression is better than no impression at all. So first impressions, make them count. Use your poster as an effective networking tool. Get people to engage with you and your research outcomes at your next conference. And here's a quick self checklist that you can also have a look at once you've planned the layout of your poster. We have several partner companies, by the way, that we work with very closely. If you'd like to get some recommendations on where you can go to get professional design, both for your graphics and also for your posters, but do your sections flow logically? Is all of the text readable? Are the graphics high quality? They never were on my posters. Is your data understandable? And is that key information standing out? Are people getting what you want them to take away from your poster? So that's preparation, preparing for a presentation. Next, we're going to talk about impact, right? Speaking effectively, giving an effective oral presentation. How are we doing, Scott? Everything going well?
Doing great. And I wanted to just double back to that previous slide if we could, Gareth. You'll notice that there are some AI infused services that are producing posters for researchers now. In either case, whether you create your posters yourself or you use a bit of artificial intelligence to help you, either way, this self checklist I think is a great resource because whether you've created it yourself or you've created it through some AI enhancements, it's always good to check it and give it that human touch at the end to make sure that everything is included.
We're always here to help as well. We're certainly human. We're not AI generated. Scott and I, we're always available if you ever have any questions about any of the content that we present in any of these webinars and workshops. If you need help to find ideas for a poster or putting a poster together, we're always here. Do check out our website, scitrain.com, if you'd like to get more information. We do loads of these kinds of events for publishers like our friends at Bentham Science Publishers. Let's move on. Let's talk a little bit now about effective speaking online or in person, how you present, how you speak effectively, communicate effectively can make a big difference, especially if English is not your native language, right, Scott? As Scott was saying earlier, it's difficult for him to give talks in Japanese, but I'm sure he does a great job.
I would like to say so, but you'd have to ask my Japanese audiences. But I think preparation, as you said, Gareth, is the key point here because once you feel better prepared, you're going to feel more confident as you start to give your speaking presentation. So I think knowing your audience is incredibly important, and I think the purpose as well, rather than trying to throw lots of details at people, as you were mentioning earlier, using your poster or your slideshow as a promotional tool to get people interested in your research, I think is a really key point. And we do find that a lot of people are not so comfortable presenting their research. Let's do another poll here. Let's ask our guests today, how do you feel about communicating your research to the public? So I'll launch the poll here. So on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being terrified and 5 being very confident, how do you feel about communicating your research to the public through public speaking, presentations, and so on?
Practice makes perfect, as we'll see in a bit. And when I started my PhD, all of those decades and decades and decades ago, I was terrified of giving presentations. And I talked to my supervisor about it at the time, and he started to set me up with small speaking opportunities, sometimes filling in for him, and sometimes for myself, but just practicing giving talks, doing it more and more helps a lot with the nerves and the presentation style. So you can hopefully you can counter a lot of this.
Certainly you can. And I think for personalities like ours, we tend to be perhaps outgoing people. I know it's even more difficult if you are a more introverted personality. But as we'll see, by practicing, no matter who you are, no matter what your native tongue is or your personality type, with some preparation and practice, you can feel confident in presenting your research to a public audience. Let's check our poll results here. Interesting. Okay, we've got a pretty confident group here. So very confident, 14% of our guests today. Well, you're very lucky. 32% feel mostly confident, 31% so-so in confidence, 21% not very confident, and 3% feel absolutely terrified. So overall, I think a fairly confident group here today. So no matter which group you fall into here on the confidence scale, hopefully we have some tips for you. Let me just
Absolutely.
share the results of that poll here. If you missed that,
Okay,
there's
there
the
you go.
results right there. Sorry, Professor, go ahead.
No, no, sorry. I mean, like, so yeah, you can practice, you can up your game, you can develop those skills, you can become a little bit more confident with your public speaking, perhaps using some of our tips and tricks in our event today. Because, of course, giving a presentation, and this is real, by the way, giving a presentation is up there amongst the top 10 things that people are afraid of. I'm afraid of going to the dentist, and I'm definitely afraid of snakes. How about you, Scott?
Yeah, this one surprises people, and this is an easily replicatable survey result. There have been a number of surveys where public speaking comes up number one. I forgot the source for this particular survey, but it's been replicated many times. So even more than things such as on other scales, you'll see things like terrorism and so on, violent crime. Somehow, public speaking frequently rises to the top. And I think part of the reason, Gareth, and I know you've talked about this in many of your presentations, is we have this feeling of imposter syndrome, no matter who we are, no matter how accomplished people are. I've met some very accomplished, experienced people who are terrified about feeling like an imposter, feeling stupid. That's sort of our worst fear when we're presenting in front of an audience, isn't it?
Yeah, and the fear of making mistakes. And that's not really what it's all about. I mean, if you do make a mistake, then just move on from it. Just, that's part of the experience. That's part of the beauty. That's part of the skills of giving a presentation. And it does come with practice. And there are some simple things that you can do as a researcher to improve your skills as a public speaker. And we're going to go through some checklists. We're going to give you some tips and tricks giving an effective presentation. But really, the most important one is planning ahead, as we've talked about already. What's the purpose of your presentation? Who's going to be in the audience so you know how to pitch the presentation? What level of information are you going to give? And what's the style? So, planning is everything, especially if you're a little bit nervous about giving that presentation. You can start planning early. You can schedule your time. You can prioritize that preparation time. You can practice. You can record your talk. You can watch and review. You can even make a script if you want, but we would recommend that you then practice your script so that it doesn't look like you're reading from a script when you actually give the presentation. Joining in with social media activities, perfecting your abstract if you're going to be putting information on to a poster. And at conferences, one of the ways to deal with nerves and one of the ways to deal with the build up to the conference is to participate in the conference before it even starts. Feel like you're part of the group. Participate in event build up. Find out what other event attendees are planning to do. Any fringe events that you can attend before the conference gets going, and find out who's going to be there and when and where so that you can plan your networking at the meeting as well as your conference poster and talk if you're giving a talk. So practice builds confidence, as we talked about already. Where are those talking points? What are you going to be covering? Keep your audience in mind and practice beforehand, right, Scott? It helps to build that confidence in what you're going to be talking about at the event.
These are all great tips, Professor. A couple of my favorites are the practice alone and with colleagues, and record yourself. These are great. Nobody likes to see themselves in video or in an audio recording. I certainly don't. We do these events pretty frequently, and I have to edit these videos. So looking at ourselves can sometimes be a little bit embarrassing, but it's a great practice to get into the habit of recording yourself or practicing with a colleague. And the last one is also one of my favorite tips. Try to anticipate some of the questions that people will ask you about your research. Make a list of potential questions, especially difficult questions, and prepare answers for them in advance. And I think that's a great way to feel more confident when you come to the Q&A part of your poster or slide talk.
Absolutely. You won't be taken by surprise. Obviously, you know your research better than anyone. It's your research, right? So you're going to be able to anticipate the kinds of questions that people are going to be asking you at the end. So you don't seem surprised, you don't get stressed, and all of that. And simple semi-formal language in a presentation is also very important. So rather than saying things like substantial research, a lot of research, the principal focuses of the study, the main aims. You can use first person active language, first person voice in your presentations. That makes you appear much more relatable, much more dealable with, and it also means that your research content is easier to understand. So, your speaking style, slow and loud, varying the tone and pitch, pausing for emphasis, sounding enthusiastic. That's really important. There's nothing worse than listening to a presentation when the speaker really doesn't want to be there. They really give you the impression that they couldn't care less. Don't talk to the screen when you're giving a platform presentation. Don't talk into your notes. Talk to the audience. Remember, you are the center of attention, really, not the slides that you're using. So you should have the audience focusing on you. And you don't want, of course, all of those, well, like filler words. You can practice, you can train yourself not to use these particular kinds of words in your speech so that they don't happen in your presentation. Face the audience using those hand gestures. Don't be stiff, moving naturally, making eye contact, and keeping your posture upright. These are all great tips for giving effective presentation so the audience knows where they are and they know that you are engaging with them, right, Scott?
Absolutely. One of my favorite tips is to keep your body language as soft as you possibly can. When we're nervous, we tend to raise up our trapezius muscles, our shoulders go up, and we look kind of square. Whereas if you can just get in the habit of rolling your shoulders down as you talk, whether you're giving a slide or a poster talk, and try to use very oval shapes. You can sort of cup your hands. You can see my body language here. I'm kind of cupping my hands around my waist here. It creates a nice, soft oval shape, and instinctively people feel more relaxed as they're listening to you if you keep that rounded body shape. And same thing for when you're pointing. If you're pointing at something on your slide, if you use very hard angular gestures or pointed people in a very angular way, it can be a bit unsettling. So get in the habit of, again, making soft round shapes with your hands as you point to aspects of your slide. And a final tip is if you're using a laser pointer, if you've ever had that jittery laser pointer when you're nervous, I've had that when I was a grad student. It was terrifying and it looked very nervous because the laser dot is jumping all over the screen. Well, one of the tricks you can use is to just rest your elbow against your body, against your waist here. You can even put your hand under there, and that will help stabilize the laser pointer as you're pointing at the screen. So a couple of body language tips that I find help a lot at conferences.
Really important. Yeah, we've all seen that jittery laser pointer. That's nothing. It's a giveaway that the speaker is a little bit nervous. Hand gestures, as Scott was saying. What are the happy hand gestures? Things that you can do to make people feel that they're part of the presentation, that they're welcome in the presentation. Can you hear me? Would you like to ask any questions? These soft shapes that Scott was talking about are really important as you give your presentation. And this is a great one. In your talk, your main message can be and should be repeated at least 3 times. And this is a great strategy. In this talk, I'm going to give you X, Y, and Z. Then you do it in the presentation, you give that information in the body of the presentation, and then of course you come back at the end and you repeat. In this talk, we have discussed X, Y, and Z, which is a really important strategy as well. Scott, how are you doing? Are you there?
Yeah, just a quick mention to our guests. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box. We'll be happy to answer your questions at the end of the talk. So no worries, no stress. Just put your questions in the Q&A and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end. So thanks very much to everyone for your questions. If you have any comments to share with us, please continue and share your thoughts in the chat window.
This is a great tip too, and this is what I always do when I have to give talks, give presentations. I check the setup before I give the talk. I go to the room, to the conference venue, maybe in the coffee break or in the break before my presentation, make sure everything is working properly. Can everybody hear me? After the presentation, as we're going to do at the end of this one today, give out your contact details. So you're always networking, you're always promoting yourself, you're always talking about yourself before, during, and after your presentation. And you think about what you're going to do, what's going to happen at your next conference. Are you going to be presenting a poster or just networking? Because really, networking and talking to people and engaging with people is the most important part of attending an academic conference because of future collaborations, future positions, becoming known in your field, promoting your work and building your skills. You don't want to be just another attendee at your next conference. Be memorable, stand out, make sure people do remember you and your work. That's the goal of attending a conference. So having talked about preparation and having talked about making an impact with your next presentation, be that a poster or a talk, we're now going to give you a number of hacks, a few tips, a few examples, if you will, to round out our webinar presentation today before we get to the Q&A. Right, Scott, some tips and tricks for our audience.
These are some of your classic tips and tricks, Gareth, and we've tried to whittle them down to just 12. Otherwise, we could be here all night. And again, we love giving this presentation. So if you're interested in having a longer version of this talk, reach out to us at scitrain.com. But we've just trimmed them down to a quick 12, and they're in no particular order. So back to you, Professor. Fire away with your top 12 tips and tricks and hacks.
Tips and hacks for giving a great conference presentation. Tip number 1, identify your message. As we talked about already today, before you begin to give a presentation, think, what is the one thing I want my audience to walk away thinking about? What's the takeaway message? Repeatedly emphasize that. Keep it simple, keep it effective, one message per slide. The second tip is to understand your audience. Who's going to be there in the talk? And I've mentioned this already as well a few times. Who are the audience? Ask this question before you give your presentation. You start to put it together because this will determine how you pitch the material. Tip number 3, of course, is timing. How long is the time slot for your presentation? Most academic conferences, 15 or 20 minutes. So you don't want to be one of those people who has to be cut off by the moderator. How much time do you have? How can you fill that time most effectively? Your message, one message per slide. That's a great rule of thumb. One slide per minute, because having to rush, skip through your slides is a terrible place to be. Avoiding death by PowerPoint is our tip number 4. There's several examples here. You're going to be creative with the way that you put your slides together, but keeping in mind that you are the center of attention, not the slides, but they are visual aids to the presentation. So tip number 4, avoiding death by PowerPoint. Tip number 5, pictures are worth 1,000 words, of course, so you do need great graphics, and you do need a tool that works for you. And you do need to keep in mind that your use of color in your presentation could be a bit confusing for some people. You need to keep that in mind as you design and promote and put out your graphics on your slides. Tip 6, how to start. Actually, my favorite tip for giving talks and overcoming nerves, and the advice I always give people when they ask me about how can I overcome nerves, is to learn and practice how your presentation will begin. Learn those first few sentences so that you know what you're going to say when you get up there on the podium. A clear and steady pace, a strong start. Engage with your audience. And this is how, by the way, you can conquer presentation anxiety, by memorizing those first few slides, first few moments of your presentation. Right, Scott? Would you agree that's a way to overcome the nerves of presenting?
Absolutely. And I think one way to do this in the context of a research presentation is to set the stage. What's the mystery? What's the question that your research is answering? If you frame it this way in terms of a story or a narrative where you are the investigator and you are solving a mystery, and you start your presentation this way, it's much more compelling. You know, this is something that we don't know, and we asked this question, and how can we answer this question? A great way to frame your research talk.
People will want to stay with you until the end of the presentation, just like writing a paper. Tip number 7 is practice. Practice makes perfect. You do need to do this. Practice in front of a mirror, in front of the cat, the dog, I don't know, the goldfish, colleagues, friends, parents. Do your dry run talks in front of an audience for conference presentations, department seminars, job talks. Very, very important. Timing your slides, knowing your slides, your transitions, preempting your content for audience engagement. And if you're going to write your talk out on a script, and I had a good friend that did this, learn it so that when you present, it doesn't look like you're reading off a script. Our tips for overcoming nerves. Tip number 8, it's completely normal, as we showed in our poll at the very beginning of our presentation today. Very normal to be nervous before you have to give a presentation, but you're the expert. And this is another great piece of advice that I was given when I was a PhD student. You are the expert. Nobody else in the audience knows more than you do about this topic. And that helps to build confidence when you tell yourself this before you have to give the presentation. Practice means that you know what to expect and check your slides beforehand. Our top tips for overcoming nerves. Tip number 9, you are the focus of attention, not your slides, not your poster. So don't hide away. Don't make your body language small. Don't talk to the wall. As Scott was saying, if you're using a laser pointer, try to keep facing the audience as much as possible and use your body language to enhance the presentation rather than to distract people from the presentation as you deliver a live experience. And I used to do this. Maybe you can relate. Don't be distracting. Don't fiddle with things while you give a presentation. Don't try to avoid those annoying speech patterns. Avoiding distracting tics, personal habits. I always used to play with coins or keys. Those are bad things to do during a presentation. You are the center of attention, not your slides or your poster. Tip number 11, react to the audience. Difficult in online presentations, we know very well, but in a live situation, you can change the tempo, change the topic, engage with your audience while you give a presentation. Ask questions maybe to get people more interested. Know when to take a break. Know when to reinforce information that you've already presented. It's a live experience. You are going to react to your audience. And tip number 12, as Scott was saying a little bit earlier, you've got to manage that Q&A. You've got to time your presentation so that there's enough time for questions, but not too many. You don't want loads of questions. You want the right number. And it's a good idea to engage when people are asking you questions. Right, Scott? Done this a lot with Q&A sessions.
Absolutely. And as we mentioned earlier, try to rehearse some or list some possible questions that you might be asked and rehearse some answers to those questions.
What
Yeah, these are
question?
some great tips, Professor. Thanks for sharing these. And I got so many ideas from reading through your list here. And I love the one that you mentioned about where you're the expert on your own research. There's no one there at that conference who knows more about your research work than you do. So that alone is enough to give us some confidence when we go to present.
It really helped me actually when I was a PhD student. When somebody in a senior position said that to me, he's like, "You don't need to be nervous. You did the research, you're the expert. Nobody else knows more than you do about this particular topic." And avoiding difficult questions is another great technique that you can develop. If you don't know the answer to a question, you can say, "I don't know. That's a great question. Let's talk about it afterwards." Great technique. Or you can say, turn the question back to the audience. "I don't know the answer to your fantastic question, Scott. What do you think is the answer?" And turn it back onto the person asking the question. These are good ways to manage that pesky Q&A session at the end. We've got some life-saving tips from PhD students that we talk to at SciTrain all the time. Just have a quick scan through these when you're putting your next presentation together. Take a screenshot or have a listen back to this presentation at the end when you get the video that's going to come in the next few days. But today we've talked about preparation, impact, and speaking effectively, and a few hacks, a few tips and examples from our own experience. And now we've timed it perfectly so that there's just enough time for questions, but not too much. We don't want any difficult ones, right, Scott?
We took our own medicine and our own advice. Yes, indeed, we did. We do have some very interesting questions from our guests today, Professor. Shall we jump into some of the questions that we've received?
100%. Great. I'm so glad that people have been so engaged. I've seen lots of things pinging in the chat box all throughout our presentation today.
Sure. And one of our guests mentions, I think very correctly, that unfortunately many presenters they just read from the slides, which gives the wrong signal. So how can we avoid this situation where you're simply reading directly from what's on the slides? Any suggestions on how to avoid this trap, Gareth? I've got some of my own, but over to you first.
Well, what I would say first of all is don't put too much information on the slides so that you don't fall into that trap. I mean, if you write a talk and then turn that talk into a slideshow, that I would say is the wrong approach, because then what you're going to do when you give it, you're going to be nervous. You're probably just going to read out what's already on the slides. So to avoid that, make your slides minimalistic with just enough information so that you have to talk about the slides rather than just reading them out, is what I would say in response.
Sure, that's a great tip. And we all do it. We're all guilty of it. We've probably done it a couple times tonight as well, where we feel like we want to give you as much value and information as we can for your time. And sometimes we put a lot of information on slides and things, but it's always a good idea to try to keep that as minimal as possible and keep the focus on you as the presenter and use your slides really as, a way to highlight some very simple or key information. Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks for your question. And let's see. Here's another question from our guest. It says, is it preferable to place tables or figures to display the results? So this is interesting. So great question. So how many of our results do we want to present on a poster or on a slide presentation? I have some thoughts on this. Gareth, how many of our visual results and
Mm.
figures should we be sharing in the context of a poster or slide talk?
Yeah, you got to keep in mind that giving a presentation is quite different from writing a paper. So probably the information that you're going to share will be less than what you might put into a research paper. And you may not want to use all of those figures that you've made for your research paper, and simplify the figures, I would say as well. So what's the main message? What's the focus of the presentation? What do you want your audience to get out of the presentation, which often means one result or two results, the simple story. So yeah, I wouldn't necessarily recommend just taking figures from your research paper and sticking them into a talk. You should keep the whole thing much simpler if you can.
Excellent advice. Thank you, Professor. We've got another question from a guest here today. Our guest says, good evening. I'm a postgraduate student from Kuala Lumpur. I really want to know how to present a problem statement of my research in a creative way. Most of the problem statements are lengthy. Your responses are highly appreciated. Well, this is a great question. So the question again is how to present your problem statement in a creative way. I have some thoughts on this, Gareth. I think, as I mentioned earlier, presenting your research in the form of a narrative, of a story. Essentially, I think if you're a researcher, you're on a voyage of discovery. You're solving a mystery, you're answering a question. So I think framing your problem statement in terms of a gap that you're answering or a mystery that's unsolved until now is a very compelling way. You know, humans love stories. We are wired to respond to narratives. So if you can present your problem statement in terms of here's a mystery, we didn't know the answer to this, but now through hard work and investigation, we have solved, or at least attempted to solve this mystery. And here's our results, and here's where we maybe need to learn a bit more. And future studies can explore this aspect of that. So I think introducing your problem statement as a kind of a mystery to be solved by you, the hero, is a great way to introduce the problem statement of your paper. Gareth, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would say I agree 100%. Scott, everybody is a learning design and development expert. So his tips for developing your research into things like stories as a way for lots of people to get something out of your presentation are really important. Don't forget that probably at the conference, many people will be listening to your talk who are not experts on your particular topic. And that's very different to reading a paper. When people pick up a paper and read it, they're going to probably be interested as an expert in that particular topic. So the way that you put information into an article is quite different. So a talk, let's say at a conference, people may know about your research field in general, but they may not know the details, and you won't have time to give them all of those details. So a story-based approach is a great strategy to keep people interested in what you've got to say. I would strongly argue.
Great. Thank you, Professor. And thanks to our guest for a great question. In fact, several of our guests asked similar questions, how to create a compelling introduction, how to structure or begin my research talk. So that was a great question. Thanks to all of those who asked about that. And oh, here's a great question. A great mechanical question. How many slides should I use for a 10, 15, 30-minute talk? Great question. As you mentioned, Gareth, earlier, the classic 1 minute per slide rule is a great guideline. It's not a hard rule, but it can be very helpful. And another tip that I would suggest for that is be prepared for if you have to give in particular, a shorter version of your talk. If you have, let's say, a 20-minute slide talk, be prepared to give a shorter version in case the person who talks before you talks too long. Happens all the time at conferences. Are you ready to give just the bullet points version of your talk without rushing through it? In other words, can you give a top level version of your 20 or 30-minute or 10-minute presentation? So to answer our guest's question, roughly 1 minute per slide, but practice giving a faster top level version of that slideshow, no matter how many slides you have in there. Any thoughts on this, Gareth?
Yeah, each slide is different, of course. Some you need to spend more time on than others. Some you might use just to break up the presentation. People often put in blank slides to focus attention back on themselves if you're going to be asking questions to the audience. But yeah, this 1 slide per minute rule is a good one. You don't need 200 slides for a 10-minute talk, but you do need, I would say, at least 10 slides for a 10-minute talk would be my response to that.
Great question. Maybe we have time for just one more. By the way, if we did not have a chance to answer your question during the talk here live, we will reach out to you individually and see if we can answer your questions if any are left over. So again, if we couldn't get to your question, we apologize. This is a great question that many people ask us and many asked tonight. How do I handle difficult or critical questions from the audience? Well, you had a great tip, Gareth, which was to turn the question back to the audience member. Well, what do you think? And I think that's fantastic advice. Another way you can approach difficult questions is to offer to reach out to the questioner after the conference and say, "That's a great question. I don't have a satisfactory answer for you right now. Could I just get your contact information? I can reach out to you with a better question later." You achieve two things. You've deferred a difficult question, and then you've also made a new contact. You have a chance to reach out to that person after the conference. And this works just as well if you're giving a poster talk or a slide talk. Reach out to that person after, engage with them and say, "Hey, I'm sorry I couldn't answer your question. I've had some time to think about it, and here's my answer."
Yeah.
Any thoughts, Gareth, on deflecting or handling difficult questions?
Yeah, I mean, if you're confident about it and you've got a strategy in mind, because unfortunately, as you know, many people ask questions not because they really want to know the answer to those questions, but because they want to make a point. They want to show that you don't know, or that they want to show that they do know something that you haven't thought of. So, as Scott was saying, the best way to do this is to stay calm, stay confident. Don't be afraid of saying, I don't know. That's a great question. Let's talk about it later in the coffee break or some way like that so that you don't have to stumble, you don't have to trip over your words. Another great strategy, by the way, quickly, if you need time to think, is to repeat the question back to the audience. So someone asks you a question, you need a bit of time to process, time to think. I would say that you can say, well, that's a great question. It's about X, Y, and Z. That gives you time to process and think if you repeat the question back to the audience. But great questions. Thank you, everybody,
Yeah,
for such
great
fantastic
questions. Excellent
engagement.
questions. Fantastic. And thank you so much, Gareth, as always. I always learn so much from doing these talks together with you. And thanks to everyone for making time out of your busy schedule to join us today. And on behalf of Bentham Science and all of our friends, we wish you great success in your next research presentation. And thanks again for joining. We will send you an email tomorrow with a full recording to the entire event today. If you missed any of Gareth's tips, you can check the recording and that'll be in your inbox tomorrow. We're also sending a certificate for joining us today. And again, thanks so much for joining. Gareth, any final thoughts before we finish today?
No, great. Thanks your time as well, Scott. Great doing these events together. Don't forget to follow Bentham Science on all of their multiple social media channels. And I think with that, it just remains for us to say thank you, everybody, for listening and have a great day. See you in the next Sidetrain Bentham Science event.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.